Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. We'd like to thank you for participating. The subject matter for today will be maintaining your certification with remote auditing solutions. Before we begin, I just wanted to go over some house rules for everyone. Obviously, we're all working remotely, so we may experience some sound quality issues, so please be patient with us. We will let you know if anything happens there, but hopefully it will be a smooth session. Secondly, all of you will have a Q&A and chat option at the bottom of your screen where you can enter all questions. We will be monitoring the questions throughout the whole session, so feel free to enter questions as they arise. You do not have to wait till the end. We anticipate about 30 minutes of presentation, depending on the questions you may have. We probably will not be able to get to all of your questions given the large number of attendees, but rest assured we will be collecting them and answering them via email over the next few days. So again, with that being said, let me move on to the next slide here. I just want to give a quick introduction on SGS before I pass it off to the presenters. So for those of you who are not familiar with SGS, thank you so much for joining with us today. SGS has, of course, many services, including certification, which we're here to talk about. We operate in about 140 countries, 94,000 employees, 2,600 offices worldwide, and we provide services in all major industries. Apart from certification, we also offer some additional added value services, which we would be happy to discuss with you offline if necessary, including training, both in compliance and subject matter expertise, performance assessments, supplier risk management services, including transparency of your supply chain and supply chain mapping, and also technical consulting, which includes lean management, continuous improvement services, and also services in supply chain operations and even aviation. Now on to our presenters. We will have three presenters today, beginning with Jonathan Hall, our Global Head of Certification. Jonathan joined us in 1992. Excuse me one second. My slides are moving around on me here. Then followed by Murray Milton, he is our audit manager here in North America. He will actually be going over a case study of remote auditing with a North America client. And then we have Chris Trott, our global governance manager, who will be managing the Q&A portion of today's session. So with that being said, I now pass it off to our first presenter, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Anna, and hello to all participants in this call. Good evening, morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. The agenda up on slide at the moment shows that we're going to look at how we got to this situation and where we find ourselves. We will talk about what a remote audit actually is, how we conduct remote audits, the criteria for participation, if you like, in a remote audit, and then, as Anna said, case study and plenty of time, hopefully, for Q&As. So, how did we get here? I think if we think back 3.5 months coming back from the Christmas or New Year break, I don't think any of us could have conceived of the situation that we find ourselves in now, with our businesses just fundamentally changed and with no real end in sight for a lot of us still. We started to feel the first effects in China in late January 2020, and obviously it's now spreading or has spread through most of the world. Very early on, it became apparent well, not just from the point of view of government-imposed restrictions, but also from the point of view of health and safety, that physical on-site auditing was at best going to be restricted, and most likely in many circumstances impossible, and that has been what we've found. So we moved quite rapidly to look at ways of supporting our customers and helping to maintain certification through that period. There's of course a number of reasons why people need to maintain certification. Some people are still up and running and need to be having continued proof of that certification in order to meet regulatory or customer requirements. At the same time, even those companies that aren't working may well be needing to consider how you come back in the future with your recommissioning and making sure your procedures are robust. And we also have the idea that, even where people are in partial work, that procedures may have changed and need to be tested accordingly. So there's still a lot of concern from clients that we continue to provide this service. Remote auditing, I'm going to go back, sorry. So remote auditing is, to be honest, already something that we offer. It's not something that was just invented in the last few weeks, but I have to say we've had to roll it out at a scale that frankly would have been unimaginable before. What is really encouraging is that most accreditation bodies and scheme owners are responding very positively to this. They recognize that we can do a valuable and valid audit under remote processes, and indeed many accreditation bodies have themselves switched to a remote audit basis. We are now being monitored, if you like, on a remote basis. That's not true of all. There are still some scheme owners with concerns. We'll talk about that a little as we go through this session today. But it is quite a complex situation, and I don't think we'll necessarily be able to cover every base during this conversation, but we can certainly put you in touch with your local office to resolve that where necessary. So what is a remote audit? Fairly obviously, I guess, it's one that's conducted partially or completely off-site using mobile or desktop applications. We'll talk about all the elements of this slide in more detail as myself and Murray go through the body of our presentations. But frankly, this is not a complex thing. The tools we use are fundamentally pretty simple, and the process is pretty familiar. The key thing is, of course, that it limits physical contact between our staff and your staff, between the auditor and the personnel that they need to audit. And with social distancing requirements in place in so many countries, that's obviously a paramount importance. We can conduct full remote audits. We can conduct partial audits. The criteria for that are again quite complex. There's at least 3 different factors coming into play. Scheme rules, some will allow full audit, some won't, full remote audit. Industry type, can we get access to all the things we need to see on a remote basis? And of course, company status, where are you in this cycle of lockdown, shutdown, close down, recommissioning, coming back up? All of those things have an influence on the scope of the audit that we can do. And in many ways, and I'll talk about this as well a bit more, but it's the audit planning stage that is the most affected by the remote audit. We do need to have access to the people who are relevant to the audit, so they do need to be working or available to be interviewed. And for some elements, of course, we would still need to access top management, albeit all of this on a remote basis. So to talk about the remote auditing process, we seem to have done so much work within SGS over the last few weeks to really try and present this process. When it comes down to it, actually, an audit process is an audit process. Really, that schematic in front of you is no different from anything else that we've ever presented in the past. The core change in emphasis, more than difference, I would say, is at the earlier stages where we do have to spend a bit more time thinking about what's going to be in the audit and how we're going to do it. So the remote, in box 1 there, the remote audit planning and assessment, we need to talk to you about the tools that are available, we need to talk to you about the people that are available, and we need to confirm with you what that scope of that audit is going to be. For the most part, we want to conduct as full an audit as possible. Where we can't, we obviously will have to catch up at some point in the future, but but the intention at the moment is to explore what we can do rather than what we can't. And then in box 3 there, the communication, again, in preparation for the audit, and as we may well find out if my phone here cuts out, a plan B for what happens when the technology fails. Otherwise, that if you look at that, it's just a straightforward audit process. We will still be auditing in much the same way. The only difference will be that it's not in physical contact. We'll still be asking questions, seeking evidence, verifying that, and reporting on it, raising non-conformance where appropriate or necessary, and assuring confidence in the management system. As I've said before, the technology is not complex. At the most basic level, we're just talking about swapping emails. But there are other tools that we're using to a greater or lesser degree. The one thing we do, as I've already said, want to make sure is that there is a plan B for an audit if there are communication problems. I think we've all found, as we've had to rely on home working tools, that they're not necessarily as reliable when they're being used in such huge numbers as they were before. So, as I say, at the most basic, we're just talking about email, but obviously the most valuable tools that we're using are the different web conferencing tools. At SGS, we tend to use Skype and Microsoft Teams, but I would say that we're very happy, and indeed there is, to some degree, there is a preference to use your own systems. I think this addresses three issues for us. First of all, there's a familiarity issue on your side. A remote audit is a new process. I can say as many times as I like that it's fundamentally the same as a normal audit, but it's still a new process. And so if people are using a tool they're comfortable with, that may help to make it a smoother process. It does tend to address any system issues on the client side, and it also alleviates any privacy concerns, although I will talk about that a bit more a little later. Seems to be my phrase of the day. We do have our own remote auditing app, QIIQ or Quick. This, again, is not a new tool. It's been being used for inspections and audits for well over 2 years now. We've conducted well over 1,000 audits, and I couldn't even put a number on the number of inspections that have been done using this tool. It's fundamentally very simple. You load it onto your phone, and then it's little more than a camera that you're just asked to guide. Asked by the auditor or inspector, asked by the inspector to basically point in the right direction and follow the leads from the questions. Moving on to what qualifies, if you like, for remote audit. And I have to say that for me, it's effectively now our default option. Those of you who are already SGS customers, when it comes to your scheduled visit, you'll be contacted by your local office, and the discussion will be about how we can do this. If there are obvious concerns on your side that can't be addressed, then we would have to consider options. But really, we can do any type of audit for most schemes under these remote processes. I think it's important to say that we can conduct partial audits even where sites are closed, if you're willing to entertain that, because we can look at some of the sort of standard management system elements like corrective action, internal audit, management review, quite independently. And as long as you have access to those records, then we have the access we need. One thing I would say on sort of privacy issues, there's always a concern around what's being retained when things are being dealt with electronically. I think the message from us is very strongly that we're not keeping any records other than those we would normally keep, our audit notes and then the audit report and non-conformities that we would raise along the way. So I think that that should be should alleviate some concerns. Again, we have the idea that this is all designed to minimize potential disruption. It's continuity of service. it's minimizing interruption. If everything is left until everybody's back at work, then really you're going to be focused on getting your businesses back up and running, and probably won't want to be entertaining auditors more than you absolutely have to. The more we can do now, the better. And also, the idea is that, I know for our business, we've had to adapt, we've had to change procedures, and there is also a need for some industries that they have to be part of the audit process more sooner rather than later. Finally, it does minimize any risks associated with capacity issues later in the year. Any certification body has a limited number of resources. If everything is pushed off into the latter half of the year, there is going to be some capacity constraints, and it's better to make sure our intention is to avoid that by maintaining service as much and as far as possible at the moment. I do need to comment on the scheme. So for the vast majority of our certificated products, we can do a very wide range of audit. But there are some schemes which have not yet accepted a remote audit is either partially or fully acceptable. That includes things like automotive 16949, many of the food schemes, SA 8000, and it's often those ones where an on-site visit is required to look at production in process or to look at conditions on the ground. I have to say that even in the last 6 weeks, the situation has changed beyond recognition. So, for instance, requirements relating to the need for on-site audit in 45001, health and safety, that's changed, and we can do far more remote auditing than we were able to do. And I think it will evolve, especially if this continues for longer than we currently hope. So the best advice I can give on the basis of individual schemes is simply to say that if you have concerns, contact your local office, contact the people that you're normally working with. They will have access to up-to-date information. We're working with all accreditation bodies and scheme owners. There's communications almost on a daily basis internally about the evolving situation. And that's probably the best way to route your specific concerns. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Milton, who's going to talk about, Murray. There you go. To Murray, and yes, so I rather blew the end there, but if we can hand over to Murray, who can continue with the case study for what actually happens on the ground in practice. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. I'm sure everyone can hear me. So this screen comes up now, getting ready for a remote audit. By this time, your local SGS office would have already contacted you and verified your ICT capabilities, that's information and communication technology, for the sites that are going to be audited. So that's part of our process of moving forward with this remote audit. Obviously, you have to have some kind of a key personnel or a contact person at your site to deal with. And also at the client site, you need to prepare other responsible people, relevant people that might be part of the audit. Some clients and sites may have different needs. For example, may need to walk down a production line. And for something like that, you might need a smartphone or something for these site tours. So that could help assist with any kind of manufacturing production processes, or just a lay of the land from the site tour. Documentation, really at this stage, you should have already been in contact with the auditor. The auditor would typically ask for your audit documentation, your procedures, possibly some records or documented information, but like internal audit, management review, that kind of stuff. So he can prepare and plan himself. So you're not waiting while he's reading the documentation. He's going to do some pre-planning, and that's pretty critical. So if he has any questions, he can either email you ahead, or that might be part of the audit as he goes moving forward. Another thing is getting ready for the remote audit is to really, between the auditor and the client, we need to verify the functionality and effectiveness of whatever platform you're using for your ICT need to test it out, share the screen, make sure it does work as intended before the audit starts, probably at least a few days ahead or a day ahead, just to make sure that it's going to move forward as anticipated. So when all this COVID-19 and remote auditing came up from the global technical team, in North America, we wanted to do a pilot audit, and that was done on March 17, 2020. And this kind of gave you an overview of the type of client that it was a surveillance audit. It's a global multi-site type company. They really service provision is what they do, and you can see in the text it's the provision of services basically, and outsourced. And they don't really have anything at site. They're kind of in an office environment, and they just work with paperwork and electronic data. So it's very easy to share through prior emails and telephones. It was very easy to kind of go through this kind of audit. But as I mentioned before, the real first step was for the auditor to work with the client and to ask what's working, what's your ICT, what are our plans, what do we need to do? To also contact them ahead and just make sure it all works. As I mentioned in the prior screen, by planning and giving the auditor the records and procedures and that kind of stuff, it really will reduce time, and it's part of the audit as well. We're planning for the audit. The last bullet talks about the audit plan, and what the audit plan really is it's the scope of the audit. And on the audit plan, the auditor will put down the processes, time slots, so you can plan accordingly at your end who might need to be attending at the specified for process for a timeline. And obviously, with any audit, there's going to be flexibility to a certain extent. That's the plan for the day, and that's what kind of the starting point is. And just to note that this audit was our first audit, and it was fully successful. We met with the intent of completing a full remote audit, and it was a pretty good case study, I thought, because it did verify the work, which was great. I mean, I think that Jonathan said we've done several thousands of audits, and this is one example of a client feedback. Not the same as the pilot audit. This is another audit or another client that we've done, and you can see that they had their own website. They in this case here, the client invited the auditor to join their website, their platform, and it's WebEx, and it worked very well. And they just for kind of understanding this type of client, they were a global multi-site client. They had 2 sites in North America, and it was a surveillance audit. And typically it was a focus on procurement, distribution, and leadership type activities. And the client mentioned they could keep the line open, and they did that just so that people can come in and go as needed to kind of ease out, and the next speaker or interviewee could kind of come in. And that even pertains even to your own remote staff. They could call in, and that's what happened during the pilot audit. There was a couple of staff working from home. They contributed whatever processes they were responsible for, and that worked very effectively. Just kind of wanted to mention that. Planning is critical, and that is the pre-planning, and that's where the auditor gets the documentation, tests the system. It's great. In this case, they used a share screen, and they had a webcam if needed. But the one thing, I think, just repeating a prior message, it's really remote audits. It's really not new to SGS. We've done lots between inspection and auditing, over 1,000 audits. I guess maybe previously it was more inspection or scheme. Now we're moving into the certification sphere, which is since the various accreditation bodies have gotten on board and opened the door for us to move forward with that thought of remote audits. So it's a team effort from everybody, from clients, from us, from our oversight committees. It's really it's a sign of the times, and we have to kind of just go with it and move with it. Okay, some client takeaways, had some pros and cons and stuff. They talk about that they're using their screen sharing and teleconferencing, and there's lots of ICT out there. The clients may have their preferred. We've done lots with Skype and Microsoft Teams, GoToMeetings, with smartphones, obviously something like with a phone with a camera, maybe FaceTime or another application that you can share images from the phone to the auditor or from the device to the auditor, and that help them validate his his site tour. Maybe he's interviewing a person on the production line, so that was really effective. And in this case here, it was a full remote audit, and they followed the audit plan. Good comment, obviously, but you can't really having a face-to-face is great. That was really the traditional type of audit in the certification world. But we were all making adjustments during this COVID-19 situation, and it's you say a little bit of a learning curve at times because it's something new-ish for some people, and getting tested and trying and verifying that it works gives that confidence level that this process works. You don't have to be in the same boardroom. You could be looking at the screen at each other from separate rooms, obviously. They just wanted to make the client here just want to have some potential nonconformity or not, but something could happen during the presentation, just to be aware. And really what I kind of want to summarize that is consider a plan B, a backup plan in the event of either your Wi-Fi goes down or something happens to your system. What can you do to ensure the continuation of this audit? And you have to be fairly plan for it and be able to switch over to it. Maybe it's as simple as a telephone call talking about it. You've already emailed records. It all depends what happens. And during the audit, just to kind of be aware, we might start off as a full audit, a full remote audit, and if something that happens that we cannot complete the audit, that would just change to a partial remote audit, and we'd pick up the remaining processes at a later date. So it's great to start now, whenever your planned audit is, and either it's going to be a full audit or remote audit, and we will work with the local office will work with our clients, and it's really there. And one comment that's under the recommendations there is seeing some of the feedback from the auditors is that it works great with the audit plan, and the client arranges using their platform for their ICT and invites the auditor to join them, and then they interviewing and reviewing a record can move forward from there. With any audit, keeping the task, time management is an auditor's nemesis. We're always fighting that anyways. So if you have the audit plan from the auditor, that's the starting point, and the intent is to complete the whole audit plan, I would say. But if something happens, we can adjust and react accordingly. And leave the line open for the audit so people can come and go. It doesn't mean you're sitting there waiting for someone to talk. The auditor might say, give me an hour. I'll be back. Maybe he's doing some reviewing of all the records you gave him. Maybe you gave him something new, and he wants to review that, and he'll get back to you and come up with other questions or recommendations, or just continue the conversation as it was. So that's pretty good. That one. Okay, the next steps. Typically put down a couple of, if you're an existing client, typically the local SGS office will contact you prior to the scheduled audit event. Normally they'd contact you, they'd send you an audit confirmation letter. They would touch base with you, and if you're moving down the remote, they would go down that process for the remote audit verification, and they'd interact with other individuals that might need be. But if you have any questions at all on anything, they should see the SGS website, certification@sgs.com. And if you're not a current SGS client, and if you're potentially thinking of transferring from one organization to our organization, that's also possible during this remote audit activity. And again, here is the same email. Just drop us a line, and we will definitely get back to you. Really, when you look at when you're thinking about scheduling audits, it's really about business continuity and business as usual. Just carrying on through these remote audits will ensure that you can achieve some sort of business continuity and business as usual attribute. Frequently asked questions or common concerns. We have a couple here, and I'm sure you're typing in your own questions as we go along. But I'll just touch on these few here. So what do I do to start the remote audit? Well, either the local SGS audit has a will contact you for your normal scheduled audit date, or you can always contact your local office or email at the prior certification at sgs.com on the prior screen. That's for the first one. Second one, if anything happens through the remote audit process, it could be a partial audit. We could do say a third, just to pick a number, of the audit on site and pick up the remainder at a later date. And again, the scope of the audit will be on the audit plan. So if it's going to be a stage 2 recertification, surveillance, and if it's going to be, it'll indicate the processes that we're looking at. What happens if your internet fails? Well, that was the plan B aspect. Have a backup plan. Think of something that if it does or could happen, what's the reaction on your side? So just consider that. And how much time? It's really the same. There's really no changes. It's typically the same time as you'd have with your contracts, with our plans for that particular audit event, whatever the timeline that's been allocated. That's typically what to expect. If you're doing a partial, it might be a little bit less. At times it might go up depending on what the risk really is and what we're trying to achieve, but typically really it's the same. And this last comment probably could apply to a lot of people. You got home-based workers, your production's not working. What do you do to move forward with your certification and maintain it? Probably start off with a partial audit, and you have your key person there. You have the processes. You can arrange the interviewees that might be needed during the audit, the remote audit. And as I said earlier, people working from home could definitely contribute to whatever process that they're responsible for, and add their comments and feedback accordingly. It might be either verbal or sharing screen information, whatever you need at that time. And just to kind of summarize this the screen here, and I think Jonathan kind of mentioned too that with COVID-19, it's constant change. There's constant procedures get tweaked, procedures for you get tweaked. Even with scheme owners, they are, some of them initially were not allowed to audit, and that's kind of changing and could change as it's a living threshold. The whole overall, the remote audit concept really it's business as usual, and it's just really a different delivery mechanism. That's kind of still doing an audit, and we're doing it remotely, and that's really it. Maybe I'll turn it back over to Chris. This is the slide overdue, Chris, for questions and answers.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for turning out today. I've been fielding all of your questions, lots and lots of questions that have been coming in, some of which the same questions keep cropping up. So for ease, I'll deal with those first, where people have been asking the same questions again. So if I'll go through them all as quickly as I can, try and get as many in. What I would remind is what Anna and Jonathan have both said, is that any questions that don't get answered, we log them all, and they will be passed to the relevant people within SGS, and they will be contacting you directly. So if we stick with the first question, it's come up fairly frequently. First question is, do all audits have to be done remotely? Well, the short answer to that question is no. And wherever possible, and I appreciate that circumstances will mediate against this, we'd like audits to be done in a normal way with visits to client offices, facility sites, etc. However, clearly there are restrictions on locations and access to locations, essentially due to coronavirus issues, and in most cases now, remote auditing is an option which should be used where we need to. But if in special circumstances we're able to visit sites and facilities, then we will do so in the normal way.
Yeah, I think, sorry, Chris, if I can just interrupt, I'd actually want to emphasise that all our officers have been given that very clear statement, that wherever possible, it is business as usual. But there's so many factors that it varies from, well, even within countries, not just country to country, but within countries.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Sorry.
Following on, slightly similar question. Can all types of audit activity be done remotely where necessary? A couple of caveats. First of all, as has been pointed out throughout this presentation, there are some standards and schemes with restrictions on certain types of audit activity that can be done remotely. Some of the GFSI-related schemes, for example, the social audits, medical device, IATF. However, where no such restrictions exist, then it should be possible to carry out all types of audits. So that's an initial audit, a recertification audit, surveillance audits, extensions to scope, etc., provided that the necessary information and communication technology tools are available and can be used, which goes back to the points that Murray was just making about remote auditing and the list of things that are necessary. A couple of people have asked about what the situation is with regard to whether or not we will be giving people specific advance notice to clients of the specific details and activities that we will need to audit remotely. Well, clearly there's going to be an ongoing discussion between clients such as yourselves and our offices about what ICT, information community technology tools are available, and therefore, as a consequence, what we can actually do remotely. As this is all part of the audit planning process, and it helps us to establish what sites, what processes and activities will have to be audited remotely, and what sort of ICT we will need to use, or what ICTs need to be available. Because clearly, if we're having to do site tours as part of an audit process, then clearly there are video capable or streaming technologies that will need to be available. The audit plan that's sent out to clients by our offices, what we have instructed all of our personnel to do is to ensure that those audit plans highlight those areas which will be audited remotely and which tools we anticipate using to carry out those audits. In the main, we'll be guided by clients as to the availability of whatever audit tools are available. But clearly, if we have our ability to do site tours, as I've already mentioned, will largely be limited by how much video capable or streaming activity is possible. Somebody has asked, if we carry out remote audits, will they get an audit report in the same way? And the short answer is yes, they will. The requirements for recording and retaining audit evidence are no different. And if we were doing a stage 1 audit or a stage 2 audit as part of the document review or the on-site audit, the audit reporting mechanisms are essentially the same. We would highlight in the report what elements, if any, had been done remotely, but that is simply to draw everybody's attention to making sure this was done remotely, that wasn't done remotely, because it helps us to identify any gaps that will need to be audited, what is still to be audited. A number of people have asked, is there any minimum information communication technology requirements? It's very difficult. Individual user guides include requirements, but it largely depends on what's available. I mean, as somebody pointed out very early on in the process, in this presentation, is something as simple as a mobile phone and email access may be sufficient to do some level of remote auditing. Clearly, the amount of remote auditing we can do is largely going to be determined by the ICT. But as a bare minimum, since most people are going to have access to email, I'm assuming, then I don't see any reason why some elements cannot be done remotely. Somebody's asked whether or not video calls via iPhone, I'm assuming they mean FaceTiming, could be acceptable. The short answer again is yes, provided they're able to be used to obtain the necessary audit evidence. I mean, largely it may be to do with Wi-Fi connections. If you're on a site, if you're taking your phone around, I suppose if you're using WhatsApp video, it would be the same. Or what's the one that we were talking about the other? There's any number of these ones that could be used. Clearly, there are security issues with certain types of applications. A lot of people, for example, will have heard that there have been queries raised about systems such as Zoom. But basically, as far as subject to security considerations and the availability of connections, adequate connections, using a mobile phone or similar to carry out such in order to enable site tours to be done remotely is perfectly acceptable. So one or two people have asked whether or not there's any license fee for them using QIIQ. Well, no, basically because it's our tool. Right, moving on. Just find some of the other questions. Okay, one or two people have asked about the situation where they have got their certificates are going to expire within the coming months. A couple of people said they had certificates which are due to expire in June and some in July. Obviously, we can't predict at this stage when we'll be able to carry out full on-site audits or combination of full and remote audits in the future. But just to set your minds at rest, the International Accreditation Forum has passed a resolution that is going to permit us, in certain circumstances, to extend the validity of existing certificates. If we are unable to complete a recertification audit, either because we can't do any activities remotely or because we can only do part of the recertification audit remotely, the IAF are going to permit us to extend the validity of existing certificates or existing certification by issuing short-term certificates covering whatever period is required, up to a maximum of 6 months. Now, hopefully we would not need 6 months because, let's be perfectly honest, if it gets to October and we've still got a problem with this, we are going to have mighty more problems than simply certification validity. But as things currently stand, if your certificate is due to run out, say, in May, and we are going to be unable to have an audit, a recertification audit, before then in order to issue a new certificate, we will have a process in place in order to you to extend your certificate for a short term up to a maximum of 6 months. Right, let's just have a look. Some of these other questions to go. Right. Can we do transfer audits remotely? The short answer is that somebody said yes. Yes, you can. They're not generally prohibited, although individual schemes, as I've mentioned, may have different rules. Clearly, if you're certified with another certification body and you're considering coming to SGS, we will do our level best to accommodate you, because there's no reason why we cannot, in principle, do a transfer of certification by remote audit, subject to the caveats and exceptions that we have already discussed on numerous occasions during the course of this. We've had several questions come in where people have asked where they've got offices and factories which are closed and there's no production taking place and client personnel are all working from home. They've asked whether or not we can carry out a partial remote auditing covering requirements such as, for example, management view, internal audits, documentation control. Yes, that's the short answer. If the facilities are closed and you're actually manufacturing anything, we can still do part of the audit remotely, essentially. But clearly, we're going to need to carry out an on-site visit at some point in the future to complete the outstanding audit elements. corollary question to that is being, if you do a remote audit and you aren't able to complete the audit fully, how long can we wait before we have to do an on-site visit in order to maintain your certification? Well, I refer back to the IAF resolution that I mentioned a moment or two earlier, and the same rule will apply. So it is highly likely that if you have a remote audit which covers part of your system, we would need to carry out the on-site elements of the audit that we weren't able to do remotely within 6 months. Otherwise, we're going to run into the problem that more than 6 months will have elapsed and the resolution will no longer apply. Okay, moving on. Looking at some of the specific questions that you've now brought through individually rather than pick these out. Okay. In the case of initial certification of a production company, do you accept remote internal audit addressing only documents? Well, the short answer to that is yes. And if we can do this remotely, then we will do. The fact that it's an initial audit, as I've said earlier, doesn't make fundamentally any difference to the process. It may well be that for reasons that would have affected an ordinary surveillance audit or a recertification audit, we're not able to fully complete the audit. That would be the only proviso I'd make about that. Similar question. We've described how we've been asked you. I have spent some time describing how we're going to be acting. What somebody's asked the question whether or not the company can do their own internal audits remotely, and what needs to be demonstrated in order for them to be acceptable. Well, exactly the same point that we've just been making to you would apply to your own internal audits. If you can carry out the audits remotely with sufficient adequate coverage in order for you to satisfactorily verify that individual procedures or individual departments or individual sites are complying with your management system, irrespective of whatever the management system is, then there's no reason why you can't do internal audits remotely. It's exactly the same principle. Clearly, you're going to have the situation with regard to the ICT, or Information Communication Technology issues, which will be the same for SGS as it would be for you. But provided you're happy that you can cover the audits remotely with your own ICT, then there's no reason why you couldn't do them yourself. We've been asked whether or not we allot the same time in auditing of certain processes using remote methods as we would do as if we were on site and doing it face-to-face. The short answer to that question is yes. One of the things that we found is that provided we do adequate planning with the client of how we're going to do the remote auditing, and this does sometimes require a more upfront planning activity than we would normally do, our experience is that we can carry out remote audits using approximately the same time frame. Okay, it might take a little longer or it might take a little less time depending on individual circumstances. But in principle, there's no reason why we should need to vary the time significantly. We've been asked, how effective is a remote audit, and does it require more frequent follow-up surveillance visits compared to conventional audits? The short answer is no, it doesn't. Don't forget what we've been saying from the outset. Your certification validity is based on the fact that we are able to carry out ongoing monitoring visits, surveillance visits, recertification visits, and the like. The only thing that's different is the process by which we're going to carry out those audits. Because we can't do them on site, we're going to have to do some of them, or all of them, some of your audit or all of your audit remotely. In those circumstances, all we're going to do is verify what we can. Ideally, we'll verify everything that we'd normally cover at a surveillance visit or a recertification visit. And provided that's the case, then there would be no reason to increase the frequency of the audit. we're just still going to carry on in exactly the same system. One or two questions have asked about if we're interviewing individuals, what privacy considerations are coming, because clearly there are going to be discussions that would, depending on the nature of the standard, some of the audited questions would need to be done in privacy for various reasons, confidentiality reasons. Well, the short answer to that is that I refer back to the earlier questions in relation to the information communication technology. Provided that the ICT can provide that sort of secure private environment, whether or not that's provided by SGS or whether or not it's provided by clients such as yourselves, then there's no reason why we couldn't meet whatever requirements. I would point out that some of the social auditing schemes, such as SA 8000, are not permitting remote audits simply because they believe that the nature of some of the questions that we're required to ask as part of that process cannot be adequately covered remotely. Somebody said here, I believe it might be a consulting company, we're planning for a client to go through a stage 1 audit covering ISO 9001, 14001 and ISO 45001. Please let us know if it's possible through remote auditing. Simple answer, yes. Similar question, can ISO 9001 recertification remote audits be conducted at manufacturing factories and analytical testing laboratories? Again, yes, with the ICT question. Provided the ICT is up to it, we can carry out all audits that we're permitted to do remotely. Sorry, I'm just trying to go down here quickly. How long is the whole remote audit process? Well, ideally, it should be the same length of time as your normal surveillance visit, because clearly or your recertification visit or any of the others, because what we're hoping is to achieve exactly the same results using exactly the same amount of time. Because if, for whatever reasons, we were entering into a situation where the remote audit was going to take twice as long, 3 times as long, 4 times as long, then there is no point in us trying to do so. Sorry. What is the plan for IATF 16949 for surveillance audits? My understanding, I mean, I don't want to go into details, but my understanding of the IATF situation is that the accreditation bodies, is that scheme owners such as VDA are extending the period from 60 days and 90 days to 120 days in order for you to get your responses back. But I have to be honest, with IATF, it's one of those schemes where there has been a reluctance to engage in remote auditing as a comprehensive solution. I can't comment on that particularly, but that's just unfortunately the situation we find ourselves in. Should there be an expectation of the remote audit taking more or less time? Well, as I said, we would hope that the remote audits can take exactly the same amount of time as it would as if we were on site. Is it possible to remotely perform a recertification for Fssc 22000? The short answer is that's an individual scheme. Some of the schemes, some of the GFSI schemes are more restrictive. That's one of the questions that I will speak to one of our food contacts and get them to respond to. Here's a question we've come in to do with the ICT. Were any of the video conferences or webcam look-arounds recorded? One of the questions that we have with that has come up a number of times in relation to the remote audits is the extent to which we retain evidence in the same way as we would if we were doing an on-site audit. Those of you familiar with the on-site audit process will know that we carry out audits, we look at things, we interview people, we check records, and within the body of the report, we identify who we spoke to, what we looked at, different types of documentation, etc. It's exactly the same process as if we're doing it remotely. It doesn't mean that we would necessarily keep the records unless the scheme specifically requires us to do so. Now, some schemes do, some schemes don't. But in the normal course of events, we would record what we looked at, whether or not we looked at it on-site or remotely, and make a reference to that fact in the report. We would not, as a matter of course, retain copies of videos or retain copies of webcam look-arounds or record live streaming events, simply because unless specific schemes require us to do so, there's no need to. Just BRC packaging, while I refer to my earlier same question, is BRC packaging allowed for remote audits? The short answer is no, although we're still waiting for detailed information from them. Confidential workers interviews we've spoken about. Question, is it possible to extend an existing certificate for X amount of time, 6 months, until the on-site auditing is possible? Well, yes, is the short answer, as I already mentioned. But 6 months is going to be the maximum amount of time that the IAF are going to permit us to have, 6 months is the maximum amount of time that the IAF are going to permit us to extend existing certification by whatever means we use, whether or not that's because of a recertification or whatever. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, time has defeated us once again. Thank you very much indeed for all of your questions. I hope I've managed to answer as many as possible. I do understand that I have not been able to address them all. But I would reiterate what I said earlier on and what Jonathan and Murray have both mentioned. We log and record all of your questions, and we will arrange for those questions to be sent to the relevant people. So if your questions haven't been dealt with, we will arrange for those people within SGS to contact you directly to give you a specific response to your question. All that remains for me to say is thank you very much once again for your attendance today, and we look forward to speaking to you again in the future. Thank you very much indeed.